John Bride awoke to a tumultuous crash as he tumbled out of his bunk and onto the floor. The floor took a sharp list and he instantly knew the ship had struck something. Or, heaven forbid, had been struck. The vessel the U.S. Navy sailor was on was a patrol vessel guarding the coast of Alaska, watching for any sign of a second invasion by the Imperial forces of Japan, like the one that had occurred in 1942. The vessel itself was the USS YP-73, a former civilian vessel purchased by the United States Navy to serve as an auxiliary patrol vessel in the Alaskan sector. Her patrol route was the Athelian Patrol. It was a minor role to play in 1945, given how the tide in the Pacific had definitively turned against Japan, but still important. The YP-73 herself was a converted fishing vessel. She was just over 84 feet long, had a beam of 20 feet, and her weight was 115 gross registered tons. She'd been manned by a crew of 16 sailors when her patrols had started, but when John Bride and William Phillips were transferred to her a few years after her patrols began, the crew had ballooned to 18. It had been a major adjustment to go from the warm weather of the eastern coast of the United States, ready to ship off to the Atlantic Ocean, to overnight being sent up to the icy coast of the Alaska Territory. At least it was important work, but not exciting. A lot of watching, but no U-boats to sink. It seemed that neither of the two later arrivals to the vessel would be buying the other a drink for sinking the most U-boats, like they had planned back when they still expected to serve in the Atlantic. The watchful days had been uneventful until the moment of the sudden crash, and the YP-73 had been a good ship to serve on at the very least. And now, that boat was filling with frigid polar ocean water. Bride didn't know what had happened, but the list the ship was quickly gaining was telling enough that she was taking on water and likely going down. For all he knew, they'd been attacked by a surprise offensive by the retreating Japanese, a desperate, last attempt to break out of the defensive war they'd been enduring since the Battle of Midway and turn the tide on the Americans again. Bride scrambled to his feet as the ship creaked below and around him. In reality, the cause of the crash wasn't the Japanese. It was January 15th, 1945, and the patrol vessel had struck an underwater reef 1,000 yards off Kodiak Island, east of the Spruce Cape signal station, and the ship was sinking into a frigid, watery grave. Bride scrambled to his feet, the only one in the room at the time of the crash, and hurried out of the barracks into the hall outside. The wood was creaking, and the ship had momentarily settled at what had to be a 10-degree list to port, and he made for the stairs to the top deck, but stopped at the base of them. Looking over his shoulder, Bride stared back down the hall towards the other doorways that led to the rest of the sleeping rooms. "William!" he shouted, but he heard no answer, and Bride found himself at a crossroads. He didn't know if his friend was back there or out on deck with everyone else. But the sight of green, foamy water gushing into the end of the hallway prompted his movement. He sprinted over the slanting floor towards the flooding to the room where his best friend, William Phillips's bunk was, and found that his gut had been right. The water was licking around the doorframe hungrily, mercilessly when he made it inside and found Phillips. Phillips hadn't been out on the top deck when the crash occurred. He'd been doing what Bride had been, sleeping after their shift, and his bunk had toppled over on top of him when the ship was jostled. Phillips was on his back underneath the toppled bed, trying to push the heavy frame off, which was pressing down on his chest. His face had turned red from both the strain and inability to breathe. "Shit!" Bride gasped. He threw himself into the room, grasped the metal bed frame, and lifted. Phillips had been pushing on it, gasping as the weight pressed into his chest, preventing him from yelling out for help, but he couldn't move it alone. The water was beginning to slop into the room, running down past the two as Bride lifted, with Phillips pushing at the same time. With a grunt from the effort, Bride lifted the bunk enough for Phillips to slide out. He dropped it again and grasped his friend by the shoulders. "Are you hurt? Hey, are you hurt?" Bride asked. Phillips was sucking in multiple deep breaths, but shook his head. "I'm not hurt." Before either could speak again, a wave of frigid ocean water gushed into the doorway as the hallway outside flooded. The waves sloshed into the room and drenched their backs. The room was beginning to fill, and the slant of the floor was getting steeper as the patrol vessel settled forward by the bow, still listening to her port side as well. "Shit, come on," Bride urged, grabbing Phillips's hand and pulling him to his feet. But Phillips's leg gave out as he tried to stand. "What?" Bride exclaimed. Then he spotted Phillips was indeed hurt. His leg had a bloody wound by the ankle. "Damn it," Bride said as the water hungrily gushed around his feet. "Okay, come on," he said, grabbing Phillips under the shoulder and lifting him up, pulling his friend's arm over his own shoulder to help Phillips get his feet under himself. As water continued flooding into the room, rising fast, they waded through the knee-deep water and out into the hallway as the floor began to take on a more severe list to the side. A sudden shudder from the ship nearly threw the two from their feet as they waded into the hallway and towards the staircase out. With the water following them like a starved, relentless predator, they waded through the freezing seawater to the stairs that led on deck. The patrol boat shuddered again as they reached the stairs, and this time, they both lost their footing for a moment. Philip slipped out of Bride's grasp slightly as he landed on his bleeding leg. "Come on!" Bride shouted, forcefully pulling Phillips back onto his feet and half carrying him over his shoulder up onto the deck as the water reached the stairs, consuming the ship as eagerly as a hungry snake would consume a mouse. The room Phillips and Bride had been in was already submerged by the time they reached the top of the stairs. Neither knew what had happened, but it was obvious that an open hole had been torn into the ship's wooden hull. Due to how fast the ship was flooding, the damage was definitely significant. Unlike when a body was injured and blood gushed out, when a ship was injured, the water gushed in. A ship didn't have to bleed out to die, and the patrol ship was dying fast in the icy Gulf of Alaska. Outside, the cold Alaskan air was whipping by and felt just as frigid to the skin as the water flooding the USS YP-73 did. The sky was pitch dark, not a star visible in the sky, and the ocean around the sinking vessel was just as black as the night sky was. But the violent whitecaps were visible out in the dark void surrounding the ship, and they didn't look the least bit inviting. As the two got out onto the top deck, they both saw the other 16 crew members rushing around as their ship slowly sank into the sea. Some ran inside the upper superstructure, others were coming down from the bridge, and others still were making their way to the life rafts. Amid the calamity, the wind was howling and icy flakes were falling from the sky, thick like rain in a monsoon, and the water swallowing the ship looked rough, unfriendly, and unforgiving, and both Phillips and Bride knew it was utterly cold. Colder than anything they could imagine, even after having been briefly dunked into it below deck. Being totally submerged in it or swimming in it would be completely different. Urging Phillips forward, Bride hobbled towards a fellow crew member who was rushing towards the stern of the patrol vessel. Bride grabbed him by the collar. "Hey, what happened? Was it the Japanese?" he asked. The crew member shook his head distractedly. "We struck a reef," he explained, shoving himself free and hurrying towards the stern. Phillips and Bride watched the sailor hurry by and vanish around the side of the former fishing vessel superstructure. Another looked down into the staircase Phillips and Bride had just come up, immediately stopped and rushed toward the stern as well, his path having been blocked by the rising water. The vessel was also creaking and cracking now. Even on the top deck, it wouldn't take long for the water to reach them. Everyone was hurrying to prepare and abandon ship. "Oh, shit," Bride heard Phillips say. He turned and saw the water was beginning to gush over the port side of the bow as the patrol ship began to go down. Bride gulped. No amount of training prepared anyone to be on a sinking ship, let alone one sinking into icy ocean water. He tightened his grasp on the arm Phillips had over his shoulder. "Come on, we have to find you a life jacket," he said, turning and moving with Phillips towards the stern. "What about you?" Phillips asked as he hobbled along with Bride. Bride didn't look at him. "You first," he said, amid the strain of half-carrying his friend. The ship lurched and began to slip down faster. The water began chasing the two up the deck just as it had been doing in the ship's interior. They headed around the superstructure towards the stern and saw everyone else climbing onto the side or jumping from the ship into the water. "Do you think they sent a distress call?" Phillips asked, the cold air biting into his unprotected skin. "I don't know. We don't have time to worry about it, though," Bride replied, grunting from half-carrying Phillips along the entire deck. The deck suddenly slanted, and the ship shook, and the wood groaned like she was screaming in pain. With that, she began to drop like a rock down into the body of water. The motion nearly threw Phillips and Bride from their feet. They could feel the ship sinking below them. The YP-73 was going down fast now. "Shit, jump!" Bride said, knowing they didn't have time to find life jackets. The two sailors threw themselves over the side and into the icy ocean. Bride surfaced first, gasping so loud it was practically a scream from the shock of the cold water. It felt like what he'd imagined being shot everywhere at once with white-hot bullets would feel like. He quickly collected himself, breathing deeply, and pulled a struggling Phillips up to the surface after he again grabbed him under his shoulder. Phillips let out a similar gasp of pain to Bride's as his head breached through the surface of the water. Meanwhile, the YP-73 shuddered and groaned again. Her stern rose up out of the sea and into the air as she filled with water. Her stern rose high up, and she settled for a moment. Then, with air gushing out of her like a geyser as she filled with water, she went down. Slow at first, but then the plunge picked up speed. It was one long, smooth slide, and then she was gone with a final splash as what air was left inside of her escaped. And Bride, Phillips, and 16 other sailors who had been on board the patrol vessel were left stranded in the freezing, icy, rough water in total darkness. A large wave washed over them. Bride spat out a mouthful of seawater and again pulled Phillips back to the surface. With his leg injury, Phillips was finding it hard to tread water. Their heavy clothing didn't help either. Both had been so exhausted that they just collapsed into their respective bunks in all their clothing. "Hold on to me," Bride said. "No, I'll wear you out faster. It already won't take long in this water," Phillips protested. "I don't care. You're not drowning out here for me," Bride argued, not letting Phillips pull himself free. "You got me out of the ship. Now focus on yourself. I'll be fine," Phillips assured, trying to pull himself free, not wanting to drown his best friend with him. "You can't swim with that hurt leg," Bride retorted, grasping Phillips by the arm and pulling him back so they couldn't separate. Before either could say any more, a large piece of broken-off wood splashed to the surface next to them, followed by other pieces of timber from the ship that had torn free as she went down. They swam to the nearest one and clung to it. It was buoyant enough to hold them both just at the surface with their arms wrapped around it. Bride put his arm over Phillips' shoulder and grasped the board on the other side to make sure he stayed on it. They could hear the other sailors shouting nearby, amid the howling wind and splashing mountainous waves, but they couldn't see them. Bride noticed ice was already forming in his hair. "Well," he said, shivering from the cold to the point his voice began to develop a stutter. At least there's no sharks around here." Phillips just groaned. "I thought I was the one who made the jokes," he said, shivering even worse than Bride was. "Well, you've been slacking lately, so someone had to do it," Bride responded. He looked around as the distant shouting continued. Do you think the others got into the life rafts?" he asked. "I don't care what the others are on at the moment," Phillips replied in a shaking voice. "I care about the fact that we're not." Bride nodded. He knew they wouldn't last long in such frigid water. Now that the initial incident was over, the two truly noticed the cold. They noticed how much they were shivering, and how much they both hurt, but also at the same time how much they couldn't feel. There was simultaneously numbness and excruciating pain coursing through every sense the two had. Even breathing felt both frigid and painful, but at the same time the cold made it short and rapid, only adding to the agony. Each breath felt like a stab with a knife. Bride groaned as the waves sloshed around them. He never expected to find himself in such a situation. Sure, he knew being on a sinking ship was a possibility, but never here, off the coast of Alaska, in freezing water that was too cold for words to ever describe. It wasn't fair, because he and Phillips weren't even supposed to be there. After the secret experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943, had gone horribly wrong and resulted in a massive death toll that had to be explained as accidental in letters to the families, Phillips and Bride hoped that they would just be able to put it all behind them once they were out at the Atlantic and distracted by the ongoing war for control of it. They'd hoped they'd be so busy that the experiment would be driven from their minds. But instead, right before they'd been due to ship out to the Atlantic in late 1943, they'd unexpectedly been shipped elsewhere at the last possible minute. Not to the Pacific Theater or anything like that, but to the most out-of-the-way place possible that they could serve instead. Instead of the Atlantic Ocean, the two sailors had found themselves as part of the auxiliary patrols off the coast of Alaska. Transferred, Bride had said when their former captain told them. What do you mean transferred? We're due to set out for the Atlantic tomorrow. Hazley, their former captain, had just shrugged. It's not up to me, he said, holding up two papers in his hands and dropping them down on the table. These orders came straight from the top. Tomorrow, you two transfer to the Alaska Patrol. They knew it wasn't a coincidence. He had wanted them somewhere out of the way, somewhere that they wouldn't be a problem, somewhere he wouldn't have to worry as much about them blabbing about the experiment, and where people couldn't ask them about rumors that might have been going around. General Aaronmore, who had nearly gotten them killed by sending them on to the USS Eldridge after the experiment to turn her invisible had gone horribly wrong and driven many of the crew into an uncontrollable homicidal rage, one side effect of the many other equally horrific afflictions caused by the experiment, including being frozen in place, becoming fused into the metal structure of the ship, complete loss of sanity, horrific physical mutations, and more. It was an experiment Aaronmore was observing on behalf of the entire United States Naval Command. After it was clear something had gone wrong on the ship the experiment was conducted on, he'd sent specifically Phillips and Bride on board because they had brothers on board the ship, who both had simply vanished and were never located. There was never any explanation. Every other crew member was eventually accounted for, save for Blake Bride and Tom Phillips. No traces of them were ever found. The grief of the unexplainable loss was something the two had hoped to put behind them, as good soldiers did, once out in the Atlantic. But the grueling Alaskan coast and constant patrols had been enough to eventually drive it from their minds. It was the one good thing about their new positions keeping them busy. But the pain of the loss never went away fully. In fact, even in the cold water, they could still feel it deep inside them. Aaronmore had wanted them here, out of the way, somewhere insignificant, a spot no one would remember when it came to history. He wanted them silenced, or put somewhere where they couldn't talk to many people. As one of the highest-ranked individuals in the entire United States Navy, Aaronmore had the power to pull such strings, to get last-minute transfers, to sweep things under the rug, to oversee such a highly secretive experiment and then cover it up once the outcome was not what had been desired. As they continued to float in the ocean, aware that the other sailors of the YP-73 were slowly falling silent around them, both Phillips and Bride knew hypothermia would set in quickly in such cold water, and then that'd be it. As they clung to the wood, being battered by the waves and wind and falling snow and ice, they stopped talking and focused on trying to stay awake. But as fate would have it, it seemed the two were not doomed to die in the cold ocean. By the time both knew they wouldn't have been able to hang on for much longer, another ship arrived. It was the Coast Guard cutter Bittersweet. It seemed the YP-73 had indeed sent a distress call before she went down. Over the next few minutes, the Bittersweet plucked Phillips, Bride, and 6 other survivors from the water, clinging to wood or onto rafts. The other 10 had all died from the extreme cold by the time the rescue ship arrived and took them back to port for medical attention. Among those who were deceased, Bride noted, by the fact that he wasn't on the rescue ship, was the young sailor who had informed them that the patrol vessel had struck a reef and wasn't bombed by the Japanese. By the last week of March, both John Bride and William Phillips had nearly regained their full strength and recovered from the ordeal. They had spent the previous roughly 2 months in a medical center on Kodiak Island. It was a good place to recover, all things considered, very well defended, even though the failed Japanese invasion of Alaska had not advanced to any point near the island. But the defenses were reassuring when in a vulnerable state. The town had been turned into a fortress due to fears of a Japanese invasion following the attack on Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese invasion in the Aleutian Islands had remained much further to the west of Kodiak and had ended by 1943. Patrol vessels like the now foundered YP-73 were watching to ensure another one did not happen, even though the Japanese were retreating on all fronts across the Pacific. Following the sinking and rescue from the ocean, Phillips and Bride both had not only developed hypothermia in the incident, but they also had spent the last few months suffering from long-term illness from it, and other effects brought on by the freezing water. Their hypothermia had been severe. Both were lucky to have survived. Both had experienced frostbite to varying degrees of severity, but nothing bad enough to result in any loss of digits or limbs, as well as inflammation in various parts of the body, fluid in the lungs, and a weakness in their whole bodies resulting in shaking limbs and unsteady walking. That they had not been able to fully shake off yet, though their strength was returning. Thankfully for them, the worst of the effects seemed to be past them and they were well on the mend. It had been a hard battle, but it was nearly over now. But they weren't fully recovered yet. They still became winded easily, felt weak, and were told they needed bed rest for an undetermined amount of time yet. Both knew they just needed more time, and were working to encourage the other. But Bride had noticed something off about Phillips in the long months of sitting side by side in one room. In fact, something had been off about him since the Philadelphia experiment. His personality had never been the same after that traumatic day, and in the few months since the sinking it had only become more apparent. Phillips hadn't told Bride any of his true feelings, but ever since the experiment on the USS Eldridge, Phillips had dealt with a lot of self-doubt, and Bride saving him from going down with the YP-73 had only dredged them back up to the surface with full force. On the Eldridge, Phillips had effectively thrown another sailor to the figurative rabid wolves. He'd done so to save his own skin. Ever since then, he'd been eaten away at inside by self-doubt about if he could be relied on, or if he'd abandon anyone in a life-threatening situation. Bride had gone back inside of a sinking ship to save him, and Phillips wished he knew for certain he could do the same, but effectively killing another sailor to save his own life had left him with a feeling that he couldn't, and that he'd always choose to save his own skin when it came down to it. Phillips wished he could convince himself otherwise, that he would be there when someone needed him, but he just found that he couldn't. Even if it was his best friend he had to go back for, that little feeling of doubt was there, chastising him over if he could or not. And he didn't see it going away anytime soon, and it made him angry. Lying on two beds in a shared room, they'd originally been accompanied by some of the other YP-73 survivors, but they'd all been discharged by the time their vessel was stricken from the naval record a month after the sinking. Since then, they'd been on their own. Phillips and Bride seemed to be the only two suffering from a slow recovery and long-term illness from the experience. The days seemed to just pass by and not much seemed to change. Though for them, little seemed to change, things on the wider scale were far from stagnant. As Phillips and Bride spent months recovering from severe hypothermia, the wars in Europe and the Pacific were continuing to rage on, but the tide noticeably had turned, seemingly definitively, to the Allies' favor on both fronts. The Germans and Japanese were both retreating, and Italy had long since surrendered to the Allies. With any luck, the two thought, the war would be over by the time they were finally discharged from the hospital. Then they could get on with their lives. Every time the radio broadcast a news report, the two listened. "How are we doing today?" a nurse asked, bringing the two coffee as their morning began, as mundane as all the others had been. "Better than yesterday," Bride said, taking his mug with a polite smile. Phillips coughed a little and took his with a silent nod of thanks. He pulled his blanket higher up around his shoulders and took a sip. "Maybe we'll get you two up for a long walk around the facility today," the nurse encouraged. A soldier entered the room, his uniform crisp and neat, adorned with medals, and waited by the door. The nurse sighed. She tucked her tray under her arm when the soldier walked in, looking displeased, but said, "You have a visitor waiting for you. When you think you can stand and be on your feet for a while, this young man will show you to him. Excuse me." She left the room and the young soldier by the door remained. He was a Marine, and remained silent as Philip and Bride cast confused glances in his direction. "Visitor?" Bride eventually asked. Philip shrugged, but didn't speak. After drinking their coffee, the warm liquid did them good. Phillips and Bride dressed themselves in clean white uniforms that Navy sailors wore, and followed the young but well-ranked Marine out of the room. They didn't speak, and simply followed him. The soldier escorting them eventually stopped at an open doorway to a conference-looking room, and stood respectfully aside, allowing them to enter. They did so. The room had no windows, and the walls were painted gray. The two sailors entered the room and stopped, just inside the doorway, at the sight of a familiar figure waiting at the table in the center of the room. Standing there, leaning against it, was General Aaronmore. There he was, like a specter who appeared the moment the two almost had their strength back to sap it all away again. Both stopped, as if they'd been struck as soon as they saw him. The soldier who had guided Phillips and Bride into the room left the door open. Perhaps Aaronmore felt he needed someone to rush in if the two lashed out at seeing him again for the first time since 1943. "Hello again," Aaronmore greeted. Or perhaps he merely felt untouchable and didn't feel the need to worry about such things. "The fuck do you want?" Phillips asked, foregoing any of the formality he had in their first meeting in 1945. "Good to see you're recovering well. I heard about the sinking of the YP-73 and personally read about each of the sailors on board to see who had survived and died." "And you were disappointed to see that we were still alive, weren't you?" Phillips snapped. A slight smile spread on Aaronmore's face at the comment, but he changed the subject. "Come in. I came all this way to see you two in particular. There are things at play we need to discuss." He motioned to the table behind him where a map was laid out. Phillips and Bride didn't move. "It's time-sensitive, gentlemen," Aaronmore firmly prompted. Slowly, Phillips and Bride walked into the room and stood on the opposite side of the table from Aaronmore. "Sorry if we're a little cautious. Last time we took direct orders from you, we ended up on a ship of horrors and our brothers missing in action," Phillips retorted, clearly agitated. Bride was silent, and after a moment, Aaronmore spoke again. He didn't acknowledge Phillips, and instead got straight to the point. "You two are aware, yes, that the Nazis have been looting priceless works of art, historical artifacts, and other prizes from museums in every country they've trampled over since they stupidly wandered into Poland. Priceless works of art, pieces of history, important artifacts, all stolen by those smug madmen. Well, now that they're retreating with their tails tucked between their legs, it seems they want to make a last effort to escape with as much of it as possible, or perhaps just ensure we don't get what they've stolen back. If they can't have it, no one can. Barbarian mentality. Plus, some have grandiose visions of Nazi Germany rising again, and if it did, they would need treasures on hand to finance another war." He paused, and Phillips and Bride both remained silent, which prompted Aaronmore to continue his brief. "Our intelligence indicates the Nazis intend to take these treasures, and a slew of other items of varying significance, and place them on a train currently traveling through regions of Poland still under German control. With them on the losing end of the war, they're going to try to make a run for it with all of these objects stashed on that train to an unknown location. It is a direct and desperate response to the Western Allied invasion of Germany. We entered Germany on the 22nd. We received the intelligence of this contingency plan on the 23rd. Unfortunately, we haven't broken the exact code they're using for the message. It's a more complex variant of one we already have, so we only understand one word in 3. So what we know is fragmentary." Aaronmore paused for breath and indicated the map laid out on the table. It was a map of Poland, with railroads highlighted. "We don't know where the train is," We don't know where it's going. We just know it's traveling right now through German-controlled territory in Poland, which is everywhere past the black line going down the middle of the map," he said, pointing. "It's gathering up whatever is brought to it at each town or station it stops in. Art, military secrets, who knows what else. Perhaps even Hitler's personal treasures. All we have are maps like this for cross-reference, but we believe the train is traveling on an unmapped, or partially unmapped, rail system that runs somewhere through southern Poland. A railroad constructed by the Nazis after their invasion in 1939, possibly ending somewhere in the Central Sudets, at an unmapped mine tunnel, or even an old one, perhaps. Or one of their many tunnels or bunkers that are all over Europe. Either way, if the train escapes with these items on board, it will likely be buried and all but impossible to find. The Nazis are nothing if not thorough when they're losing. They choose to do this action specifically when losing the war instead of diverting manpower and resources elsewhere, only to keep these items away from us. Due to the historical significance of the artifacts in consideration, and of the military interest in some of the other items that are also likely being taken to the train, we cannot let that happen," Aaron Moore explained, like he was briefing soldiers he was about to send into battle. It was a tone Phillips and Bride did not like hearing. It was just like the one he had before sending them onto the USS Eldridge. They also did not like where this conversation seemed to be going. Last time they had a brief like this from Aaron Moore was also right before he'd sent them onto the USS Eldridge. So, we come to it now. We're sending you two, just you two, behind enemy lines. Your objective is simple. Find and stop the train at all costs, Aaron Moore finished. Are you mad? That's the heart of German-controlled territory. We'd have better odds parachuting into Iwo Jima and hiking to where our boys currently are without having any weapons than we would walking into Poland right now where none of our boys are. Phillips all but shouted. Why would you possibly send us to do this instead of some special operations team, like the Army Rangers or something, Bride asked, shaking his head, not believing what he was hearing. Hell, drop an airborne division into southern Poland and secure the rail lines. Don't have us walk in there and expect anything. Poland is crawling with the Germans right now. There's probably a gun behind every bush, a tank hidden in every barn. Why do you think we can do this? He couldn't believe they were being dragged helplessly back into another one of Aaron Moore's games. I watched things carefully, and in the experiment, he said the word carefully, as if not wishing to admit it ever actually had happened out loud. I saw that you both were quick on your feet, had fast reactions to changes in a situation, and were good at thinking your next moves through in a tough situation. I heard your reports on everything that happened inside the ship and the choices you made to escape, Aaron Moore replied matter-of-factly. I feel confident you can pull this task off. Do we even look like we know how a train works? Bride blurted out. I feel confident you can figure it out, Aaron Moore curtly responded. Fuck you, and fuck your feelings, Philip said. And fuck all your medals. How many people did you put in their graves to earn those? Is each medal pinned on that uniform a dead man? Are two of them from Tom and Blake? He added, pointing at the medals hanging on Aaron Moore's uniform. He was barely restraining himself by the time he was done. A year and a half of held-in rage was threatening to burst out like water from a falling dam. Aaron Moore did not react to the insult. His bushy mustache didn't even twitch. We're not trained for this. We're Navy sailors, not ground infantry, Bride added. You'll sail to Europe before the end of the week. You'll be at the front in 7 days at most. You'll be given a more detailed brief before you set out, given all the information about where the train should be that we have available. You'll be outfitted in standard infantryman uniforms. You'll be provided weapons, ammunition, food, water, grenades. A few little treats for the road, a compass, and a map like this one, Aaronmore said, lifting the corner of the map off the table for a moment. I'd recommend trying to find a German map of the rail lines and compare them. Some soldier might have one, or some abandoned camp might. You might also find one in a town along the railroad. Use one if you find it, and look for discrepancies or rail lines that don't appear on our maps, either at all or merge off of lines that do appear on ours. Find the train, Aaronmore finished. Phillips exhaled hard through his nose. And board it like cowboys holding up a train in the Old West, he said, fed up already with the whole thing. And hold it until the Allied line reaches you. At no point should they be more than a few hours behind you. The Germans are retreating, so progress is fast, Aaronmore repeated. In summary, your mission is to stop the train so the approaching Allied forces following you can secure it, along with all the gold, artifacts, and everything else on board it. As I said, they'll only be hours behind you. If you can find the train, stop it, and secure it, you should have no further trouble. As I also said, the Nazis are retreating fast and won't have time to go back and look for it once they realize it's overdue. While traveling, keep hidden when possible. Expect traps, ambush zones, radical fanatics who might do who knows what now that they're losing. Don't trust any beggar on the road. Don't trust any closed door in any building. You see a tank that's abandoned, you chuck a grenade into it just to be sure. Don't trust anyone or anything until our boys catch up to you. Phillips snorted, noting an all too familiar twinkle in the general's eyes. He put on his poker face. He didn't believe a word that he was hearing from the general's mouth. Aaronmore wasn't this stupid, he knew, to send them to do this if it was something he truly wanted accomplished. He had other motives for sending them to Poland, and Phillips knew what they already were. Hell, he knew it wasn't a coincidence that he turned up now, after they'd narrowly survived one catastrophe and were still recovering from it. He knew it wasn't a coincidence Aaronmore turned up when he and Bride were still standing on shaking legs, with weakness in their arms and shortness of breath after too much exertion. Are there any questions? Aaronmore asked. Neither Phillips nor Bride spoke. They knew from before that they were helpless to stop something Aaronmore had put in play. The amount of strings he had to have pulled to get this insane mission approved must have been more than there were sailors on the USS Eldridge when all hell broke loose on her in 1943. Aaronmore nodded, and now smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Neither was the sparkle in his eyes. Good. You are dismissed. As Phillips and Bride left the room, Phillips turned to Bride as they walked back down the hall towards their room. You see that look in his eyes? He wants us to fucking die on this mission. Bride nodded. Of course he does, he replied. Why do you think he's sending just us into the heart of German-controlled territory? We survived the sinking, and that put us back on his radar. Got him thinking about us again, and what we know. So he wants to try and have us silenced in a way that won't raise eyebrows before the war ends. And here's his opportunity. If we die in Poland, we're just two nobodies killed in action. Nothing suspicious. And no chance we'll ever talk about everything we saw happen because of the experiment, Phillips finished, shaking his head in anger. It was just like the USS Eldridge, though. They knew they had no choice but to go along with Aaronmore's game. And this time, they would have no flares to get them out of danger. It was in the first week of April when Phillips and Bride found themselves outfitted in infantry uniforms, helmets sitting loosely on their heads, holding rifles just like the ones they'd been given when they were sent aboard the Eldridge, and making their way across the countryside of Poland. They couldn't help but feel strange wearing army attire and not Navy uniforms. They also felt weird about being on the ground in the middle of the war. It was something completely alien to them and unlike anything they were trained for. They'd been trained to fight out on the ocean, on ships, and sink U-boats, not be on the ground and possibly engage with enemy ground troops. As they made their way through the countryside, they hadn't seen anything save distant farmhouses, some still having livestock in the surrounding fields, others seemed empty and abandoned. The sky had also been overcast and gray since they arrived. They were now well beyond the line of Allied-controlled areas, far from any towns and deep in southwestern Poland. It was still territory being held by the Nazis. Where the train was supposed to be, they had no idea. It was like chasing a ghost. They hadn't seen so much as a rail line since they'd hiked out past the line and into enemy territory days earlier. The Allied line was ever expanding, though. Explosions sounding in the distance almost constantly told the two that they weren't too far behind them, just too far back to be of any help to them if things became dicey. They'd been walking through Poland for days, sleeping in shifts at night, but could now see something promising. Far ahead on the horizon was the hazy outline of the mountain range where the train was supposed to be heading to. It was much further into German-controlled territory than they were now, in territory the Allies were nowhere near claiming yet. The Germans might have been retreating, but their grasp over Poland was still as strong as it had been since 1939 when they invaded. This deep in enemy territory, Phillips and Bride both knew that there could be a gun aimed at them from any distant window or from behind every tree that they passed. Cross-checking their map with their estimated position, they knew miles ahead would be a road that led to one of, if not the last, town or village that the train would likely be passing through, according to the information that they'd been given before setting off for Europe. It was a town with a name that neither could pronounce, but they felt confidence they could find their way there at the least. It was based on shaky intelligence at best, but it was better than nothing. The road that led there was still miles ahead, on the other side of the hills that they'd come to. When they reached the road, they'd have to head left to reach the town, which was several miles further away from the spot they'd come to when they reached the road. Their progress also wasn't as fast as either would have liked. There were still times when their legs became weak, when their arms shook, when they had shortness of breath. They were still not fully recovered from sinking into frigid ocean water for an extended amount of time. Definitely not to the point of doing the kind of physical activity that they were, but they had no choice but to carry on, pausing for breaks when needed. They knew it wasn't a coincidence Aaron Moore had sent them when they did. They were more vulnerable in their current state. Their water was gone by the time they'd been traveling through the hills towards the distant road. The last stream they'd come to had not been in a state that allowed them to refill their canteens. The stream had been filled with the corpses of cattle, riddled with bullet holes, along with the bodies of what seemed to be every man, woman, and child from an entire small village, floated and lining the banks or caught in the stream itself. It seemed the Nazis had leveled an entire village and executed all the inhabitants while they retreated. For no reason other than just because they could. And the water had obviously been poisoned by the amount of bodies lying in it, so the two carried on after taking a moment to fully take in what they'd seen. They knew similar sights must have been all over Europe, and that fellow American soldiers following behind them would likely find the same thing. Do you think this is what the paratroopers found when they parachuted into Europe last June? Bride asked after they'd stumbled upon the scene and taken in the true horror. Philip shook his head. I hope not, was all he said. The sight made him sick to see. It was such a pointless waste of life. Bride was the one who pulled them away from the stream. He placed a hand on Philip's shoulder and turned him away. Then they walked away without looking back. So they continued forward and traversed the miles without speaking much, resting when they needed, moving towards the mountains, which didn't seem to draw any nearer. But then, out of the blue, Philip suddenly stopped and exclaimed, "Shit!" and threw himself to the ground behind a bush. Not knowing what his friend had seen, Bride followed his example and did the same. After a moment of nothing happening, he poked his head up and saw what Phillips had seen. He saw Phillips was peeking through the top of the blades of grass, and over his friend's shoulder, Bride could see it. Nestled ahead of them, off to their side, was a machine gun nest. It was not abandoned like everything else built by the Germans they'd passed thus far had been. The shapes of German soldiers could be seen sitting in it. Bride crawled up to the bush and peeked through it too once he was certain they hadn't been spotted. "How many are in it?" Bride asked after a moment, hanging back. "Looks like 3, Phillips answered, not taking his eyes off the gun nest. "The hell are they still doing here? The German line is retreating," Bride whispered. Phillips shook his head. "I think they're taking some lessons from the Japanese," he replied, glancing back over his shoulder at Bride. Seeing the confusion on Bride's face, he continued, "It's just 3 guys. I think they broke away from their battalion and stayed behind intentionally. They're going to ambush the Allied line when it comes through here, right over the hill. Whatever group it ends up being, they'll walk into a kill zone," he clarified. "That's suicide for them," Bride responded, his voice getting slightly louder. "The Germans," he added. Phillips motioned him to keep it at a whisper. "Exactly. Hence why I said the Japanese are teaching them a thing or two. They know it's suicide. Any large battalion will overrun them in seconds. They just want to take out as many people with them as they can," he said, glancing back at the nest. The nest was circular-shaped, its border lined with sandbags, and sitting at the front was the machine gun resting on a tripod stand, able to be swung around and fired in any direction with deadly accuracy. "Assholes," Bride muttered, shaking his head. He sighed. "We can't leave it." Phillips tightened the grasp on his rifle, like he was about to stand up and open fire at the nest. "I know," he said. Bride put a hand on his shoulder. "It's also just the 2 of us. We can't just rush in there. 10 guys couldn't do it without 8 of them getting mowed down first. Use your head," he firmly said. Then added at more of a whisper, "So instead, we crawl around them, under their sight line, through this high grass, until we're behind them, and then we hit them from behind. With any luck, we'll take them out before they realize and turn the gun around. We can't leave it here to ambush whatever battalion comes through." Phillips nodded in agreement to the plan and took one more glance at the machine gun nest through the bush. He shook his head, angry. "Shit," he hissed out. Then he motioned Bride to follow him with a jerk of his head and got down onto his belly and began pulling himself forward on his elbows, pushing with his legs. Bride did the same and followed him after a moment. Slowly, keeping as low to the ground as possible, they crept forward, using the grass to keep them out of sight as they began to circle around to the back of the nest. The thick blades of grass kept them hidden from view, but the grass was thick enough to also keep the nest hidden from their view and anything else. So Phillips didn't see the viper ahead of him until he was nearly nose to fangs with it. He jerked back from the venomous snake, which had opened its mouth threateningly. It hissed loudly at the sudden movement and took off, slithering away into the grass. Though he managed to keep from shouting at the startling sight of the deadly snake, the snake itself made noise, both as it hissed and then as it took off into the grass. It was loud enough for the Germans sitting in the nest to hear it. Phillips and Bride heard them talking, and, with a cautious glance through the top blades of grass, they saw one of the soldiers climbing out of the nest. He jumped over the sandbags and started walking in their direction, holding a rifle up and ready. Phillips and Bride both pressed themselves down onto the ground, Bride putting a finger to his lips as the soldier slowly walked closer. As the soldier drew nearer, Phillips very slowly sat up on his elbow. Then he slowly brought his rifle around and aimed it at the approaching soldier, moving slow as to not audibly brush the grass aside, bringing the sight up and level with his eye. He moved the gun so it was lined up perfectly with the soldier's head. He slowly confirmed a bullet was in the chamber, placed a finger on the trigger, and kept his gun trained on the soldier. He took his eyes off the soldier to look over at Bride. Bride was staring back at him, but couldn't move. The approaching soldier was much closer to him than he was to Phillips. Too close for him to risk even shaking his head to tell Phillips not to fire. Phillips returned his gaze down the sight of his gun, glaring down the barrel at the soldier. Finally, when the soldier was so close that Phillips could see the grass reflecting in his blue eyes, when he was about to step right on Bride, he stopped. He scanned the fields around the nest, but didn't look down at his feet, where Bride was all but laying. Not seeming to be satisfied with not spotting anyone, the soldier brought his rifle up to his shoulder and fired a few shots into the grass past where Phillips and Bride were laying. It was clear to both that he was trying to flush out something or someone. But when nothing jumped out or seemed to react, the soldier seemed satisfied. He lowered the gun, turned around, and walked back to the nest. Phillips lowered his gun and sat up enough to watch until the soldier climbed back into the nest. Then he dropped to the ground and sighed as quietly as he could. Bride shuddered and allowed the tension to leave his body, and he lay limply on the ground for a few moments as he tried to stop shaking. He heard his heart pounding in his ears, and he took several deep but quiet breaths to calm himself down. Phillips also slumped onto his back and took a moment to allow the tension to melt away. That had been far too close for comfort. They stayed still for a minute before, prompted by Phillips, they continued to army crawl along to the other side of the nest. Phillips was now watching for any snakes or other animals that he might startle. Slowly, the two sailors continued crawling through the long grass until they finally got around behind the nest, placing them on slightly higher ground than it was, giving them a perfect shot at the soldiers in the nest below them. Lying on the ground side by side, they unslung their rifles and got them ready. Then they slowly set up into a squat once they were sure none of the Germans were looking up the rise at them. Once they were ready, Phillips softly counted down from 3. Once he reached 1, he and Bride stood up out of the grass and fired at the same time. 2 of the German soldiers in the nest dropped right away once the bullet struck their back. The third, who had been between the other 2, only had time to turn around, a look of shock on his face, before he too was struck in the chest by 2 bullets simultaneously. He was flung back by the bullet striking him and fell against one of the sandbag walls, splayed on his back, facing the sky with a blank, opened-mouth expression. With a third soldier on the ground, Phillips and Bride ran forward and aimed their weapons down into the nest, but there were no other soldiers hiding at the bottom. It had only been the 3, which convinced them both more that it had indeed been a splinter group who were only trying to kill whomever they could in a final stand. With the skirmish over, they both sighed in relief, and Phillips jumped down into the nest. He stepped over the bodies and ejected the ammunition from the mounted machine gun as Bride kept watch. Once he'd taken it all, he threw the bullets as far off into the grass as he could. He sighed and slung his rifle back over his shoulder, and Bride lowered his own. "Bastards," Bride said. "We could have just used one of our grenades. Thrown it in once close, they wouldn't have had time to register what it was," he pointed out as Phillips turned to look up at him. Phillips shook his head. "We should probably save them. They might be needed later." "What are we gonna do? Blow up the train?" Bride asked. Phillips shrugged. "Maybe the track," he said, looking down at the bodies lying at his feet at the bottom of the nest. He kicked one of the corpses. "Besides, it felt good to do this myself. They deserved it. All of them." "No argument there," Bride agreed, as Phillips wiped one of his boots on the swastika armband around one of the Nazis' dead uniforms before climbing out of the nest. As he did, Bride slung his gun over his shoulder too and pulled their map back out. After a quick scan of it, he said, "That road shouldn't be too much further ahead. Another 2 miles, maybe? Once we get there, we can just follow it straight into the town that Aramore said is where the train is likely to make its last stop before it heads off into the unknown." He looked up. "You need a break, or are you good?" Phillips nodded in reassurance. "I'm good. Let's go." Bride folded up the map and stuffed it into his uniform. "I do wish we had some water, though," he admitted, smacking his lips. Phillips looked at him, then took his canteen off his belt, shook it, and held it out to Bride. "There's a few drops left," he said. Bride hesitated, but Philip shook it again. "Go on, take it." Bride did so, and they set off again, heading towards the road. Though both knew they didn't have a hope in the world at actually stopping the train, unless it was with a grenade, but they both knew they at least had to try to do what Aaron Moore wanted. Just like they had to on the Eldridge, even after they had realized something was very wrong on the ship. If they didn't at least try, and they managed to survive, then who knew what Aaron Moore would do to them? He could easily have them disappeared, and no one would ever know. The two eventually came to the road they were looking for. It was a dirt road, worn with wheel tracks from both wagons and motorized vehicles. It worked its way through the fields and forests of the countryside, vanishing around a bend behind a hill to their right, and working its way off into the distance on their left. Phillips and Bride came to it as they reached the bottom of a hill. The dirt road ran along the base of two of them on each side. The bushes and long grass reached out into the road as if trying to consume it. They'd only just stepped onto it and off the hill when they heard something coming around the bend to their right. "Hide!" Bride whispered, grabbing Phillips by the arm and pulling him back into one of the bushes growing along the side of the road. Lying in a ditch under the shrub, weapons held out the ready, they watched as a horse-drawn wagon came around the bend in the road, heading in the direction they'd be traveling as well. It was being pulled by a single horse, and being driven by what seemed to be a lone German infantryman. Phillips and Bride watched from their hiding place as the wagon drove past, noticing that it was loaded with wooden crates in the back. As the wagon passed them, Phillips suddenly jumped up and ran out into the road behind it. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the back of the soldier's head, the bullet punching through his helmet. He slumped forward, and the horse reared back and neighed in alarm as Phillips ran forward to calm it down. Stunned for a moment at the sudden action, Bride didn't react for a moment, not until Phillips had calmed the horse down and was climbing up into the wagon and patting down the body. "Damn it," he grumbled, crawling out from under the bush and coming out onto the road as well. "William, what the fuck are you doing?" he yelled. Phillips didn't answer. He checked to confirm the soldier was dead, patted the body down, and pulled out a Hitler Youth knife from one of the uniform pockets, and then climbed into the back of the wagon, opening the crates and rifling through the contents. "Phillips!" Bride sputtered. Phillips didn't answer, not until he'd opened the last crate. "No gold or art anywhere. All they had are crates loaded with these," he said, pulling out a clean, folded uniform. He set his rifle down and held one up to show Bride. "These are Waffen-SS uniforms." He looked back at the uniform and then back at Bride. "We need to change into them and get out of ours. We might as well be wearing American flags if we stay in what we're wearing now. Not what we want to be wearing when we walk straight into the town ahead, which is going to be full of these guys," Phillips said. Bride sighed in frustration, grumbled, but nodded in agreement and caught one of the uniforms when Phillips threw him the shirt, followed by the pants from another crate. "Any helmets?" Bride asked after catching the articles of clothing. Phillips shook his head. Bride nodded. "All right, we'll have to ditch ours then. It'd be pretty conspicuous to walk into a town filled with Nazis while wearing American helmets," he said, unclipping his helmet and taking it off. He tossed it over into the grass, and Phillips repeated the action a moment later. "Some treasure hunter will find those in 100 years, Bride said. They both then grabbed the SS uniforms and began to slide them on. As Bride slid it on over the uniform he already had on, he felt dirty putting on a uniform that was designed to associate the wearer with some of the very worst of the Nazis. Phillips seemed to feel the same because neither took their American uniforms off, save the helmets. They just put the SS uniforms on over the top of it. As he and Phillips changed into their disguises, Bride spoke again. "What's going on with you? Why are you charging head-on into every opportunity for a fight?" Phillips also sighed in frustration and looked at Bride as he was buttoning up the SS uniform over his own. But after a moment he answered, "I'm just going through some stuff right now. The sinking of the 73 really just dredged some old feelings back up, okay?" Bride shook his head, but gave an understanding nod. Just keep your temper in check from here on, okay? The more skirmishes we get into, the more likely we are to get noticed. I hate these guys as much as you do, but for God's sake, think your actions through. Just think next time. You're gonna get us both killed if you keep this up. Those words ripped into Phillips like a knife, doing more damage than any bullet ever could. He didn't answer. He just focused on finishing buttoning up his disguise. Once he had the SS uniform on over top his own, Philip slipped the Hitler Youth knife into his waist belt he was wearing underneath the SS uniforms, but he slipped the holster with his pistol onto the belt he was wearing on the outside. Bride didn't think to conceal anything on himself. Once they were in uniform, they grabbed their weapons off the ground, freed the horse and smacked it on the hindquarters to send it on its way, hid the body in the grass, and set off down the road towards the town. Once we're no longer in hostile territory, we'll talk about what you're dealing with, okay? Just for now, keep your head level, Bride said as they set off. A few miles down the road, as it crested a hill, the two sailors paused and then ducked behind some small trees, looking down below them. They hadn't reached the town yet, but something had appeared ahead. The road went down the hill and then back up another, but before it did, it passed by a lone farmhouse in the vale. There was no movement around the house, but what seemed to be a tiger tank was sitting behind it, near the barn and animal corral. Phillips and Bride shared a look. "What do you think?" Bride asked. Phillips looked down at the house. "We have to check it," he said. It was the perfect place to observe for the movement of enemy troops, and the tank showed that the Germans had taken it over at some point. Bride nodded in agreement, and they crept out from behind the trees. Slowly creeping towards the house, Bride put his hand on Philip's shoulder. "If someone is there, do you think it'd be less conspicuous if we're just walking towards the house, rather than sneaking, given what we're wearing?" Phillips glanced down at the SS uniform he had on, then nodded. He didn't sling his rifle, but held it more casually and stood up straight. "It's the opposite of the Elderidge. We can go 2 feet on that ship without sneaking," he mused. Bride cracked a small smile, and they proceeded down the road towards the house. When they reached it, they approached the front door, and Phillips pushed it open. He and Bride stood up straight, trying to look official and demanding respect, on the off chance Germans were inside, but the home was empty. Stepping inside, they found the owner's possessions had been shoved into a side room, and that the living room and kitchen had clearly been used by the Nazis for something. A left-behind radio set hinted at the home being used as a hidden listening station of some kind. It seemed that the Germans had left recently, and in a hurry. As Phillips scanned through the home, Bride looked over into the room where the owner's possessions were piled up. A little girl's porcelain doll was sticking out of the pile, staring sadly at the floor. Bride shook his head in disbelief. "They chased a family out of their home," he said. "I hope they chased a family out of their home," he added, thinking back to the stream. It was as if the Nazis wanted to burn the world down now that they couldn't have it. He entered the main room and looked at the radio equipment that had been left behind. Something on the table next to it also grabbed his attention, and he picked it up. It was a German colonel's visor cap. Phillips came back into the room. They didn't just, hopefully, chase the family off. "Come here," he said. Bride dropped the hat back on the table and followed him down into another hallway, and stopped when Phillips pointed at the floor. "Tripwire," Phillips said. It was at the end of a hall, at the entrance to another larger room. Cautiously, Bride peeked his head around the corner and looked back at Phillips. When they left, they filled the house with explosives and left a tank out back to bait our boys in when they passed by. That many crates of explosives could take out a whole division if someone stepped on that wire. Would for sure take out the whole house and yard. He shook his head. "Pricks," he scoffed. Phillips nodded. "Yeah," he agreed, stepping back from the wire, which seemed to be something similar to a fishing line, and went out the back door. He now had his gun up, on the off chance some of the Germans were still around. Bride followed him, and they approached the tank. Stopping the train would be easy if we can figure out how to work it, Bride commented. Phillips nodded and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He climbed up onto, and then inside of, the tank, but re-emerged at the top a moment later, shaking his head. They completely destroyed the controls. This thing will never move again. He climbed out of the tank and jumped back onto the ground. Let's go. There's nothing for us here. We're wasting time we don't have. They went back inside and, after finding some scissors, they cautiously cut the tripwire and left the house, heading back onto the road to continue towards the town that they were seeking. It didn't take long after that before the road wound its way through the fields and countryside, through a small wood, and then down into the village. It was a tiny place with mostly wooden buildings. At the opposite end of the town from where Phillips and Bride were approaching it was a rail line, and sitting at what was clearly a train station was a train. All around it and throughout the town, Nazi soldiers were walking around, entering and exiting buildings, and loading crates of varying sizes onto the train cars. Most of the cars were cargo-oriented, but there was one armored car adorning an anti-aircraft gun, and a few others were also passenger cars. Several soldiers were boarding as well, while others seemed to be staying back. Vehicles were also coming in from other roads and stopping around the train, with their own cargo being emptied out and placed onto it. The Nazis were clearly evacuating and doing it quickly. There were no civilians anywhere in sight, both sailors noticed. It seemed that the entire population of the town had been relocated, just like the family from the farm had been. It seemed that the population had been put onto trucks and driven away, hopefully not in the same way that the other town's populace had been relocated. By the time they arrived into the town, the sun had all but set. Some gray-orange color remained in the sky to the west, but other than that, it was fully dark out. Due to the overcast sky, no stars were visible, but the glow from the waning half-moon faintly was. A ghostly, pale white orb shining through the clouds vaguely revealed where the moon was. The poor, near-moonless night obscured Phillips and Bride as they arrived and aided them in not being noticed. No one looked Phillips and Bride's way as they walked into the town. Walking along the main road like they belonged there, Bride leaned over and whispered to Phillips, "That's it," as he pointed at the train. Phillips nodded. "Now, let's just find out where it's going." They headed straight for the train station. Several distracted soldiers hurried past them. No one looked at them or spoke to them. Everyone seemed to have an assigned task that they were hurrying to complete. One soldier shoved past the two and muttered something but didn't look at them. It was a strange feeling. As Phillips had pointed out earlier, on the USS Eldridge, he and Bride had been forced to try and stay out of sight of every possible person on the ship. But here, even though those instincts were screaming at them to hide, they could just walk right past the threat, right out in the open. They didn't draw attention to themselves. They knew they'd probably not be noticed. "If we find any unoccupied helmets, we should probably put them on. Less chance someone will notice us because right now we're the only ones without them," Phillips whispered as they walked up the street. Bride nodded, but it wasn't entirely true, technically. The captains, colonels, and other commanders overseeing the hurried evacuation were wearing hats. As Phillips and Bride reached the train station, they glanced back at the train that they'd come so far to find. "Think we could slip on and hijack it now?" Bride asked. Phillips shook his head. "No. Look at the amount of passenger cars versus how many people are here. Not everyone is leaving with the train. Our best bet is to find where it's going and head that way so we can cut it off. Less people to contend with," Phillips whispered. "Besides, do you know how to drive a train?" "No," Bride admitted. Phillips nodded. "Me neither. We'd be gunned down if we tried now." They slung their rifles over their shoulders and walked into the train station. Some lanterns were burning on a few tables, but the building was empty. Charts and lists were lying everywhere on tables. It seemed to be a checklist of what hadn't arrived yet, or what hadn't been picked up at previous stops. On one wall, tacked onto it, was a large map of Poland. Bride reached underneath his disguise and pulled out from a pocket in his uniform the map of the rail lines in Poland that Aramore had given them back in the United States. He unfolded it and walked towards the wall with the larger map. Phillips grabbed a lantern and followed him. Bride spread out the map and held it against the wall as Phillips held the light up. checking theirs with the Nazis' version, looking for differences in rail lines heading south towards the mountains. At first, seeing no differences, Bride located the town they were in on their map and began tracing the rail line running out of it and comparing it to the big map as he did. Then they both saw it. A rail line that didn't exist on their map branched off from the same line on the Nazis' version, and it ran straight into the mountains. No such branch was present on theirs. Bride felt an adrenaline rush go through him. "That's it," he softly gasped. That was the plan. The train would merge off the line on their map and onto the secret line that wasn't present on theirs. From there, it would head to the mountains. "God damn," Philip softly replied. "They really do have a secret rail line. The train goes that way, merges off the main line, and vanishes. And I bet the guys who stay here follow later and destroy the line, and that's it. No one would ever find the train." Bride shook his head. "Brilliant," he couldn't help but say. "You want to hide your spoils of war, build a secret rail line, and do it, then destroy it when you're done." They knew at that moment the train was picking up a large amount of stolen art and gold that had been brought to this last stop before it set off and was hidden. The two could only imagine what works and masterpieces were stashed in those crates being loaded onto the train at that very moment. Another town with a station was further down the line, but the secret line on the Nazis' map branched off from the line before the train would reach it. Once it headed down the route that didn't exist on their map, it would reach an area of the mountains filled with abandoned coal mines, hundreds of them. No doubt it would go inside one of those mines and never be seen again. "It's gonna go into an abandoned coal mine," Bride said. Phillips shook his head. "Intelligence told us in the brief there's hundreds in that area. If it goes there, no one will ever find it. That's such an easy place to make something disappear. All they have to do is rip up and bury the tracks on their way and seal off the entrance, and it looks like a mountain. I think you're right, that a large number of these guys are going to stay here and destroy the tracks once the train goes through. The ones going on the train are probably just going to guard it just in case." Bride shook his head. "God damn it," he swore, louder than he intended, but no one outside seemed to hear. With the amount of passenger cars the train was pulling, only around 1/3 of the soldiers in the town could fit on the train at the absolute most, meaning at least 2/3 or more would be staying back and likely destroying the tracks before retreating further into territory still under Nazi control. "So what do we do?" Bride asked. "Well, we can't just hijack it, but maybe we can slip on when it's being loaded. Where the secret line branches off isn't too far. If we're not on the train when it leaves, I don't know if we can catch it," Philip said, examining the map again. A voice suddenly came from the door, and the two turned around to see 3 Nazi soldiers standing in the doorway to the station. The one in the middle marched towards the two, flanked by his fellows, who were armed, and shouted something. Not knowing what to do, neither Phillips or Bride knew what to say. They didn't speak, and the man grabbed the map from Bride's hands. He scanned it, and then seemed to notice something because his eyes widened. The soldier suddenly looked back up at them with an accusatory glare. He turned the map to face the two. Only now did Phillips and Bride notice something minute that they hadn't picked up on before, but now knew was very intentional. General Aaron Moore's personal seal had been stamped onto the bottom right corner of the map, and the United States Navy symbol had been stamped onto the left. Those had not been on the version of the map Aaron Moore had shown them in Alaska. He had added them to this one himself. The soldier shouted again, likely demanding to know why an American general's personal seal was on a map in possession of what appeared to be Nazi SS soldiers. When Phillips and Bride didn't answer, he snarled something in German, and the 2 other soldiers grabbed Phillips and Bride and dragged them outside. The soldier who had taken the map marched out the door and shouted something. And as soon as Phillips and Bride were pulled outside, several other soldiers ran up, took their weapons, and hastily patted them down. They looked distracted by the bigger task, but felt in all the pockets. They took the grenades, pistols, and other weapons they could find. Once the search was done, Phillips and Bride were pulled out into the road and marched towards the train. The soldier who had taken the map was speaking to a well-dressed captain who turned to face the scene and walked towards Phillips and Bride. They were restrained in place as the Nazi captain stopped right in front of them. He stared at the two without speaking for a moment, his icy eyes licking over each detail of what he might have assumed to be busted informants for the Americans at best. He had a poker face as good as Aaron Moore, and nothing got through the armor. There was no chink in it to read or hint at what he was thinking. The Nazi captain then seemed to notice something off about Bride's uniform and pointed at it, loudly ordering something in German that the two couldn't understand. A soldier stepped forward and roughly undid a few buttons and pulled Bride's outer uniform back, revealing his American uniform underneath it. The captain seemed to tense up. His eyes widened slightly. "Americans," he hissed. The soldiers all around began to look in all directions, as if expecting an attack to come at any second. The captain froze from his surprise for only a moment before he looked around and shouted out several quick orders in German. Soldiers suddenly began running all around, grabbing boxes and taking them to the train or loading tools onto trucks. It seemed that the evacuation was picking up the pace. The captain then turned to face Phillips and Bride again. After looking at them for a moment, he turned to his man and began speaking. When it came to the German language, Phillips was hopeless, but Bride could sometimes understand one word in three. But he didn't understand a word of what the captain was saying. He dreaded what it was if it was relating to him and Phillips. As several soldiers closed in on Phillips and Bride, the captain barked again and they stopped. He turned away and grabbed 2 ropes from the back of a truck and tossed them to 2 soldiers standing behind the 2 sailors. He'd ordered them to execute the Americans, but not to waste the bullets they'd need later while doing it. Phillips and Bride were marched out of the town and up a hill, flanked by 10 soldiers. Soon, a line of trees came into view at the top of the hill, and the 2 German soldiers leading the march stepped forward. They checked a few trees with the lanterns they were holding, seemed to find one they thought was satisfactory, and then tied 2 nooses at the end of each rope. They then threw the other end up into a tree with large branches. Bride began panicking at the sight, knowing what they were going to do to them. "Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God," he stammered, tears he couldn't hold back beginning to fall down his face. Phillips didn't say anything. He just looked at the ground, looking like he'd resigned himself to what was about to happen and to the fact that they couldn't escape with so many armed soldiers guarding them. Out of the 10, 8 had their guns pointed at the Americans. The other 2 were getting the ropes ready. The soldiers seemed to be in a big hurry because they didn't tie Phillips or Bride's hands behind their backs. They just slipped the nooses over their heads and tightened them around their necks and walked them to the base of the trees. The 2 who seemed to be in charge of hanging them then stepped back and grabbed the other ends of the ropes, giving a tentative tug to make sure the branches would hold the weight. Then, pulling on the ends of the ropes, the Germans hoisted the sailors up off the ground. Bride gasped and grabbed the rope, strangling him. Once the 2 were several feet off the ground, the Nazis tied the ends of the ropes around another tree to keep the Americans hanging from the branch and stood back to watch. As he hung by his neck from the branch, Bride tried everything he could to pull the noose away from his neck, but it wasn't a battle he was winning. His legs were kicking at empty air, seeking any foothold, but none were there. He gasped over and over, but only pulled in a tiny amount of air with each gasp, not enough to keep his strength up. As the seconds ticked by, he became frantic for air and kicked out more desperately, but each kick made the noose feel like it tightened around his neck even more. He needed to breathe so desperately, and he gasped for air over and over, but he just couldn't breathe. Bride gasped, but no air came in, and trying to pull the rope away from his neck did no good. As both the lack of oxygen and the weakness in his arms he'd already been dealing with combined, Bride lost the ability to try to keep the noose from strangling him, and his arms fell down to his side. His body went limp as he hung there, rope tight against his throat, his mind fogging, and his vision slowly blurring and fading to darkness. The light from the lantern the soldiers were holding was the last thing to fade away. He slowly stopped swinging as the moments passed by and hung from the tree, unable to move as the feeling in all of his limbs ebbed away into nothingness. Bride's last coherent thought was that Aaronmore was gonna get what he really wanted, after all. The breath suddenly gushed back into his body, and Bride gasped. His eyes shot open, and he saw the limbs of the tree above him. He was lying on his back on the ground and sat up, gasping and coughing at the same time. His hands went to his neck, and he yelped when he felt the noose still tied around his neck. In a panic, he grabbed the rope, pulled it over his head, and threw it off to the side. He then fell back onto the ground and took several deep breaths, trying not to break down and sob. He failed. Philip sat next to him, massaging his own neck, but otherwise seeming to be handling being hung by the neck much better than Bride was. But he didn't interrupt his friend and let him cry until he stopped on his own. Once he had mostly calmed down, Bride wiped his eyes and sat up. He coughed and asked, "How?" His voice was very hoarse. Phillips looked down at the ground and held up the Hitler Youth knife he'd taken from the young soldier driving the wagon. He waved it slightly before lowering it again. "They didn't find it when they patted me down. They just took what I had on the outside. Either they didn't notice or just didn't think I had anything stashed under the borrowed uniform," he said. "But how?" Bride asked again, still taking deep breaths to get oxygen back into his system. Phillips looked at him. "I faked passing out. I kept my hands between my neck and the rope, but I pretended to pass out. God, it hurt, because I've been really feeling that weakness in my arms over the last few hours. I just had to hope that they really were in a rush to get out of here, even more so because of us, and that they would leave once we passed out. They did. Once you went limp as well, they only stayed for a second and then turned and walked away." He paused to rub the bruise visibly developing around his neck. "Once they were gone, I reached one hand under the SS uniform, pulled the knife out, and cut the rope. Then I cut the rope anchoring you in place. You weren't breathing, so I had to give you rescue breaths. After a few seconds of that, you gasped and woke up." Bride took everything Philip said in for a moment, rubbing his aching neck for a moment, and then he spoke again. "Thank you." That was all he said before he looked down at the ground, shaking his head. He sniffed and wiped fresh tears from his eyes. Another cry was threatening. He held it in and wiped his eyes and kept the tears back. "It's all fucked up. All of it," Bride said, his voice breaking. Phillips nodded. "Yeah, it is," he agreed, looking at the knife that had saved their lives, taken after the end of another. They sat under the tree for a few moments of silence. But Phillips finally sighed and spoke again. "John, I've not been myself. I know it. He paused. "I've been dealing with self-doubt ever since the experiment, and the sinking of 73 really brought it back in full force, like I told you earlier." Bride looked over at him as Phillips continued. "The sinking made it worse because you came back and saved my skin. If you didn't, I would have drowned. I wouldn't have gotten that bed frame off me. And it goes deeper too. Back on the Eldridge, there was this young guy, about our age, younger, I think. I don't know who he was. He'd been fused into a bedpost by whatever the hell happened. He was alive, totally fine in the head, unlike the majority of the deranged crew. He was pleading with me, save me or put me out of my misery. But there were these deranged sailors outside, and at first I thought they'd been driven into an animal-like state. They were hunting like big cats almost. But then I saw them pull out knives and attack this frozen sailor, and that made it much scarier because that meant they were still as smart as me. They weren't rabid animals mindlessly attacking something. It meant rather that they were people with an uncontrollable urge to kill." Philip sighed. "I basically gave that guy to them on a silver platter. He was fused to a bed. He couldn't move anywhere. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight back. I shot him. I thought about doing it in the head so he wouldn't feel what they did, but I needed him to scream so they'd go to him, so they wouldn't think to look for me. He was pleading with me not to do it, but I did. I shot him in the shoulder. They came in, and I ran once they started ripping into this poor man. I did it so fast, too. It was the first thing I did. Save myself is all I was thinking. Everyone else be damned. He looked over at Bride now. And you know what happened next? You found me on the deck being attacked by those sailors crawling on all fours. I was out of bullets, but you saved my skin. You didn't leave me out to dry and save yourself. Ever since that day, I've always been worried that I wouldn't be able to be the kind of person who can stay back and save someone. Even you, or Tom if he was here. I essentially killed that sailor to save my own skin, and ever since I've never been able to see myself as the kind of person who wouldn't do it again, or the person who wouldn't leave someone behind. I thought for a time I'd gotten past it, and I told myself I'd follow a friend into battle anywhere. But damn, it really came back after the sinking. After you came back to save me. It's made me so angry. It's made me lash out, be reckless. Sometimes want to die, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I've been acting since January. God. He trailed off and put his hand to his head, rubbing his temple. Bride didn't respond for a moment and then said, "That's not true. William, I know you. I know you would go back for me, or for Blake, or Tom. You would." Philip shook his head. "You don't know me," he said. "God damn it, William, I do," Bride said, speaking louder even though it hurt his throat. Phillips whipped around to face him. "Did you not hear me?" he snapped. "I killed that guy on the Eldridge. I mean, I didn't, but I did at the same time. Ever since, I've always had this self-doubt about if I'd ever be able to go back for a comrade, even for my best friend, you. The sinking really brought it all back up. That's why my temper has been so short lately. It's why I've rushed into every fight, like that machine gun nest or that guy driving the wagon. You're right. I did just rush out there when the wagon went by. My temper got to me. I didn't check if anyone else was around. You kinda knocked some sense into me after. If you hadn't, I'd have probably just started chucking grenades once they grabbed us. But I did what you said. Bided time until I had a chance. So you see, ever since the experiment, I've had doubts as if I could go back and save someone, or if I could stay back and not throw someone to the wolves. And that's twice in the last 3 months you've saved my life. That's what I'm dealing with right now. You don't get how it makes me feel. I don't deserve to be your friend. I'm a selfish asshole who only cares about himself." He shook his head, as if Bride hadn't heard a word he said the first time. He couldn't fathom that Bride would remain so calm with him considering what he told him. "Yeah, I heard you. I heard you explain it the first time. You're not hearing me. You're not hearing me when I say you are the best friend I met outside that theater with Blake. You're the funny man from our little posse. I remember you warned me about what Bruno did on C deck. You saved my skin on the Eldridge when I saw that guy in the hallway. And on the Eldridge, you know what else you did? I realized that the wireless operator might still be alive. I turned around and ran back inside of that ship of horrors. And you came with me. You followed me back inside when neither of us had any bullets left. Those afflicted crew members were getting closer to the upper decks, but you still followed me back inside of that ship, and you didn't hesitate. I know what kind of man you are. Bride looked at him. I know what kind of man my best friend is. A man I'd follow into battle anywhere, and a man I know will always have my back, no matter how dire a situation gets. When Phillips looked back at him, this time it was him who had tears filling his eyes. He seemed to be overwhelmed quickly because Bride suddenly found himself being pulled into a painful hug as Phillips began to sob. Shaking sobs, as the emotions he'd held inside himself since that day in 1943 finally spilled out of him. Phillips's whole body shook with the force of his emotional crack-up. Each body-shaking sob was so powerful, it was like Phillips was being struck in the back with a hammer swung by a strong man you'd see perform in a circus. You're a good man. Don't ever tell yourself otherwise. How do you think Tom would feel if he knew you were thinking this way? Bride asked. Phillips sat back and chuckled a little, still crying. He'd think I'd gone bananas, he said, laughing. I'm thinking that too, Bride chuckled. Phillips shook his head. Watch it, or I might not tell you next time Bruno does something. They both laughed. Despite the situation they were in, they laughed. You remember that time Bruno set his parents' barn on fire? Bride asked after a moment. Philip shook his head. No, I don't actually, he sarcastically replied. But what I do remember is the time you had a mouse in your house, and Bruno thought it was a good idea to bring the neighbor's cat over to catch it. Yeah, suddenly we had an angry cat running around the house, clawing things up, Bride chuckled, shaking his head. Bruno then decided to bring in another neighbor's dog to catch the cat. And when that didn't work, Bruno decided, okay, enough of that, Philip said. Okay. But I will add, I remember that Bruno got his butt tanned by both my dad and his, Bride replied. Good thing Bruno got stopped. Who knows what would have come back with him next? He might have tried to bring in an alligator next. They sat in silence under the tree for a moment, before Bride chuckled and said, Do you think Bruno has sunk any U-boats? Philip snorted. If he has, we both might owe him a drink, he chuckled. Bride shook his head slightly. You know, when we made that bet, I always thought it would be Tom who won. We always called him Deadeye when we went shooting. Phillips nodded. No bottle or can was safe. Now that they had a quiet moment, amid the calamity of the war, the two both truly felt the losses of their respective siblings again for the first time since the experiment. Bride wiped his eyes. What do you think happened to them? He asked. Philip shook his head. I don't know. I just hope it was quick. I wish they were still here, though. I think Tom would have really knocked some sense into me years ago. A sudden whistle in the distance brought the two back to the moment, and they looked down into the town. The train was moving. The cars had been loaded and were slowly being pulled away from the station down the tracks by the engine. Bride stood. Shit! He looked at the train pulling away, and then held a hand out to Phillips. We have to do something. Phillips nodded and took his hand. He stood next to Bride, sliding his knife underneath his outer uniform again. After Bride pulled Phillips to his feet, they looked down at the town, seeing the train was pulling away and picking up speed. Bride shook his head. We'll have to go after it. We have to try. How? Make it up. It's what we've been doing, Bride replied. Any ideas? Phillips bit his lip, then nodded after a moment. There's a tunnel not too far ahead down the track. A couple of them. I saw them on the map. We can catch the train at one of them. And then what? Bride asked. Board it like cowboys holding a train up? Phillips shrugged. Then he took off at a run towards the town. Bride. God damn it, he's back, Bride said, following. They hurried down the hill and snuck into the town. They kept out of sight, but Phillips had to take out one guard with his knife when they found where the weapons were being stored. Remaining undetected, they hid the body inside a barn, stole rifles and slung them over their shoulders, they stole pistols and slid them into their holsters, made sure they had ammo for each, and found that the Nazis had horses in the town. They were tied to trees near a few vehicles, but ready to ride. Before any of the Nazis left in the town knew what was happening, The two Americans who had been marched off to be hanged burst out onto the main road, riding their own horses. Phillips and Bride rode in a quick circle around several bewildered Nazis as they caught their bearings. Then, with a quick kick to spur their horses, they took off at a full gallop. Before any of the Nazis could really react beyond shouting, the Americans rode off on horseback to the end of the street, turned off the road at the station, and took off at a full gallop down the tracks. Several soldiers yelled and gave chase on foot, but the Americans quickly rode out of the town, following along the tracks, following the train. The few soldiers who tried to follow stopped the chase quickly, seeing that it was a lost cause. Achieving its full speed, the train rumbled down the tracks. It entered a wooded area, the forest on all sides serving as good concealment from Allied planes that could begin flying overhead any time. Even if they did, the armored rail car near the front had a powerful anti-aircraft gun ready to shoot them down. Those on board felt smug and sure that they'd escaped with all the stolen gold and artifacts that had managed to reach the train before its final departure for the secret line. Some of the work stashed on board went back several centuries, and once they were hidden away, the Allies would never find them. Finally, if the Nazi regime ever bounced back, they could recover the artifacts. Those on board were riding to their destination in luxury, surrounded by it too, and passed the time smoking, talking, eating, or playing card games. The train picked up more speed, and it was nearing the point where it would turn off the map line onto the secret track. Soon, it would reach the mountains and be hidden away, with all the art, artifacts, gold, and information on secret projects that was stashed on board. Cresting a hill and coming to a road, Phillips and Bride rode towards where it crossed over the train tracks. They came to the overpass quickly and saw the train passing through the tunnel under the road. "Yeah!" Phillips yelled, kicking his horse in the side to speed it up. Bride did the same, snapping the reins to make his go faster. At the tunnel, they dismounted and looked down at the train cars passing underneath. The train was moving fast, and it seemed like it was still picking up speed. Most of the cars were already through the tunnel, and only a few had to still pass under the overpass. Phillips lightly tapped Bride on the stomach. "Jump!" he said. "What?" Bride stuttered over the sound of the train. Phillips nodded and patted Bride's arm. "Yeah, like cowboys holding up a train, remember?" he said, and leapt onto the roof of the car passing underneath the bridge. It was nearly the last one. "Oh God," Bride said, but did so as well, following his friend, and landed right behind Phillips on the roof. The tunnel quickly fell into the distance behind them. "Let's go," Phillips said, pulling Bride up, and the two took off at a run across the roof towards the engine. They reached the end of the first car and jumped to the next one in line. "The train is moving southwest quickly," Bride shouted, "and gaining speed fast. The place it'll merge off isn't far ahead. Let's see if we can get to the engine before it gets there," Phillips replied, and they began running again. They leapt from car to car, working their way up the line quickly, but the engine didn't seem to get closer no matter how many cars they jumped to. The train was pulling way more cars of looted art and gold than they first thought. Each leap was a gamble in the darkness. A single misstep would have sent either of them plummeting underneath the wheels. The wind was howling by like a typhoon, and the wheels below the train cars were roaring, becoming louder like a screaming beast as the train gained speed. "God, how many cars of stolen artifacts are they hauling?" Bride asked after they jumped to the fifth car, each loaded with plundered art. Phillips stopped, but he didn't answer Bride's question. He held his hand out to stop Bride and squinted at something ahead, hardly even visible in the darkness. Bride expected Phillips to motion them forward again, but instead, he jerked back. "Shit! Duck!" Phillips shouted, throwing himself to the roof and pressing himself flat against it. Bride saw what Phillips had and quickly did the same, throwing himself flat onto the roof next to him. Moments later, the train car they were on passed under another tunnel, the last one before the merge-off. The brick top of the tunnel was mere inches above the two sailors' backs. Once the tunnel passed, Bride gasped like the wind had been sucked out of him. Phillips tapped his arm. "Come on, most of the cars have doors on the end, where they couple together. We'll go through the door and go through the cars as long as we can, rather than over them," he said, jumping to his feet. He pulled Bride to his feet as well, and they hurried to the end of the car. They climbed down the ladder and jumped over the coupler onto the next car. The next car, by chance, happened to be a passenger car, and they opened it and went inside. They met eyes with several surprised Nazis who were sitting at the booths in the car. Everyone froze, some halfway through setting down a playing card. The stare-off lasted for a few seconds, then everyone started raising their guns. Phillips and Bride had their rifles up first and opened fire at the soldiers. Several fell to the floor with bullet holes in their uniforms, and Phillips and Bride ducked behind the booths at the end of the car. The soldiers left were shouting and firing at them. "Fuck!" Bride shouted, ejecting the empty clip from his rifle and sliding a fresh one he'd grabbed from the town into the gun. He stood up and fired at a soldier who had been creeping up the center aisle towards where he and Phillips were taking cover. The bullet struck the Nazi soldier in the face and flung him back into another soldier. Phillips stood up and shouted, "Fuck that guy, and fuck you too!" He fired at the startled soldier who was holding their dead comrade. A few more bullets went flying through the air, then all the soldiers who had been in the car lay dead on the floor. With the Germans in the car all dead, Phillips and Bride ran out of their hiding place and towards the other end of the car. They opened the door, but found the car ahead was a cargo car with no door on the outside. "We'll have to go on the roof again," Bride said. "That was short-lived." Phillips nodded. "I think some of the cargo cars do have doors, though." "Well, this one doesn't," Bride said, sliding his rifle over his shoulder and stepping over the coupler. He climbed up the ladder at the end of the next car and up onto its roof. Phillips followed him. As they got up onto the roof and crouched, preparing to run for the next car, they heard distant shouting echoing from somewhere ahead. "Think they heard the shots?" Bride asked. Phillips reloaded his rifle with a clip Bride handed him. "How could they not have?" he asked, throwing the spent one off the side and sliding the new one in. He stood up and Bride followed suit. "Let's go," Phillips said. They took off at a run again across the roof. When they got to the end of the car, they saw the next one had no door at the end, and they jumped across the gap to the next car. They were halfway across the roof of this next car when Bride grabbed Phillips by the shoulder. "Look," he said, pointing. On the next car, another passenger car, soldiers were climbing up onto the roof. "Shit," Phillips said with gritted teeth, unslinging his rifle and firing at the nearest soldier. The bullet struck his hand as he was pulling himself onto the roof at the end of the car, closer to the sailors, and he yelped, falling down into the open gap between the cars. Bride also unslung his weapon and aimed it, fired, and struck one of the soldiers on the next car in the chest. They gasped, he fell to his knees, and slid off the side of the car, flopping onto the ground, looking kind of like the rag dolls that Bride's little cousin played with. He and Phillips kept firing as the Nazis climbed up onto the roof, each of their shots hitting true. They didn't let up or give the soldiers time to get ready to fire back. "Well, it's not U-boats, but I hope you're keeping count. You might owe me a drink yet," Phillips said once the next car was clear and he and Bride ran to the end of their car, climbed down, and entered the empty passenger car. They paused. The cargo cars must have all been stuffed full of stolen art, as full as they could be, because this car had also been stuffed with artifacts as well, leaving only a few tables open for the soldiers to sit. Slightly shocked at actually seeing some of the stolen artifacts, Phillips and Bride slowly walked up the aisle, looking at the pieces. Paintings, statues, other artifacts had been stuffed into the car. Bride slung his rifle and grabbed a painting. "This is a Van Gogh piece," he said, showing Phillips. "Yeah," Phillips murmured, walking a few steps further down the aisle. He passed Greek statues, framed pencil sketches, paintings by famous artists from previous centuries, weapons that looked like they were made by the Romans, but something more modern lying on a table in one booth caught his eye. He picked a document up off the table and showed Bride. "Don't suppose you can read it?" Bride set the painting down and shook his head, but took the paper and scanned it anyway. The lights in the car were a dim yellow, but they gave enough glow off to make the letters on the paper out. Bride looked back up. One word here and there, but the word Wunderwaffe is on here. Wonder weapon. William, they're not just transporting art on this train. At the very least, they're also transporting plans for secret weapons. Maybe even some prototypes. It's a cache of everything they want to keep hidden, Phillips realized. Bride nodded. At least everything they were able to get loaded on here. Maybe some of it never made it, but look at everything that did. I wonder if these wonder weapons are what Aaron Moore was really interested in acquiring on the off chance we actually pulled this off, Phillips muttered. The wall at the opposite end of the car suddenly exploded and huge bullets flew into the car. Multiple ancient statues were shattered, paintings were shredded, and artifacts exploded into pieces. "Shit, go!" Phillips shouted. He and Bride ducked down on the floor when it started, and they crouch-walked back to the door they entered through. Exploded, splintered fragments of artifacts raining down on them the whole way, and they hesitantly climbed up the ladder and onto the roof of the car to see what was going on. Peeking across the roof, they saw that the next car was neither a cargo or passenger car. It was the armored car, topped off with a massive double-barreled anti-aircraft gun that was firing shot after shot into the car Phillips and Bride had just been inside of. The gunner didn't seem to care if he destroyed the yard or not. He was just hell-bent on eliminating the American cowboys who had boarded their train. "We can't just rush that. That guy will see us, aim that big gun up, and blow us away," Phillips said. "We'll climb around the outside, cling to the roof, and use the window frames like stepping stones to pull yourself along." "Oh, great," Bride mumbled. "See you on the other side," Phillips said, climbing down the ladder and going around to the left side of the car, climbing out of sight. "Other side of the train car, I hope," Bride said, but he did the same. He pulled himself to the right side of the car and began pulling himself along, stepping on the window frames as he went. The man operating the anti-aircraft gun hadn't stopped firing. It seemed like he was going to keep going until he reduced everything inside of the car to dust. As Bride pulled himself along, a tree branch snapped past. He suddenly realized how dangerous his position was, and he pulled himself along faster. The last thing he needed was to be hit by a tree or a sign along the railroad. Bride quickly reached the end of the car and looked around the edge at the man. Deciding it would be too awkward to unsling his rifle and shoot from the angle while hanging on the side of the train, he pulled his pistol out of the holster. He fired at the soldier and they fell backwards. The big gun stopped firing as he was flung back. Bride pulled himself around to the front of the car and saw Phillips doing the same. He also had his pistol out, and he laughed. "I think we fired at the same time." Bride nodded, holstering the weapon. They kept moving, climbing over the armored car, and from the top they could now see the engine ahead in the darkness. Between it and the two sailors was another cargo car, then another passenger car, then 3 or 4 more cargo cars after that. "Nearly there," Phillips said. They crossed to the next cargo car and pulled themselves up the ladder. As they got to the top, they stopped. Standing at the opposite end of the car's roof was a Nazi colonel. In all likelihood, this was the commander of the train operation, the man who would oversee what happened to it. And it seemed he had come to deal with the American wannabe cowboys himself. The colonel's cap blew off in the wind. A sudden gust occurred as the train shifted slightly. Phillips and Bride realized they were pulling away from the main track. "We've merged onto the secret one," Phillips urgently said, raising his rifle. The colonel did the same with his own weapon, a pistol, and fired first. The bullet struck Bride in the shoulder. Bride screamed, losing his footing and falling onto the roof. Phillips fired, but his shot was wild and missed. The colonel aimed his pistol towards him, so Phillips yelled and threw the rifle. It spun through the air, but its butt struck the colonel in the face. He stumbled, firing a bullet into the roof as Phillips pulled out his pistol and fired several shots. The colonel ducked down and began firing back. Philip felt a bullet graze his leg and he stumbled, but he didn't fall. He aimed his next shot and squeezed the trigger, but the gun was empty. The colonel attempted to fire too, but his gun also clicked. "Damn it," Phillips said as the colonel snarled and rushed them. "Take the rifle. I can't shoot it with my arm out of commission," Bride shouted. He pushed it towards Phillips. Phillips grabbed it, but before he could aim, the colonel tackled him. He grabbed the rifle and pushed it down on Phillips's neck, pushing as hard as he could. Phillips felt his neck getting crushed, but he couldn't push the colonel away. Phillips was seeing stars when Bride was suddenly there. Over the colonel's shoulder, he delivered a strong right hook into the colonel's ear. The man yelled and whipped around and tackled Bride. He lost the rifle in the struggle, and it slid over the side and was lost. Bride tried to get his pistol out, but the colonel knocked it away from Bride's hand, and it skittered down towards the end of the car. Phillips coughed, still gasping for air, but when he saw the colonel getting Bride into a chokehold, he snarled. Bride was right. He wasn't going to let his friend down. Phillips crawled on all fours past the scuffle and grabbed the pistol. Sitting, he turned around and aimed the gun towards the fight. The colonel was tightening his grasp on Bride's neck. Even in the dim light, Phillips could tell Bride was turning purple as he tried to get free, but he couldn't escape the chokehold he was being put in. One twist, and the colonel would no doubt break his neck if he didn't just choke him to death. Phillips wasn't going to turn away, though, and keep going for the engine. even though it was a near impossible shot that he only had seconds to pull off. He had to shoot past Bride's head to hit the colonel from the angle he was firing from. This was the moment he'd prove to himself what kind of man he really was, and he wouldn't waste it. He aimed. The wind was making holding his arm steady impossible, as was the shakiness that was creeping in again, and the nighttime light made getting a clear view of the shot impossible as well. He saw the colonel tightening his grasp on Bride's neck. Phillips steadied his aim, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The shot was nearly impossible even in good conditions. Phillips had only a tiny, narrow open window to hit the colonel over Bride's shoulder, but the bullet struck true. It ripped into the colonel's head, punching into his skull above his left eye. He fell back onto the train car's roof. Bride gasped for air as the man's grip on his neck slacked, and he pulled himself away, coughing. Phillips dropped the pistol. It slid off the side of the car and went tumbling into the darkness, and crawled forward, reaching his friend as he gasped for air. "Are you okay?" Phillips asked over the roar of the wind. Bride wheezed, but nodded. "Give me a moment," he said, spitting a glob of blood out of his mouth. He didn't seem to have the strength to push himself back onto his feet. He did finally sit back on his knees and looked at Phillips. Thank you." Phillips nodded, knowing there was nothing to say. He stood up, looking over his shoulder towards the engine. "How much longer do we have before we get to the mountains?" Bride asked, still wheezing slightly. Phillips shook his head. "I don't know. I can't see them in the dark. The map made it look like miles, though." He grasped Bride by the arm. "Come on, we have to go," he urged. As Bride climbed to his feet, he shook his head. "Do we even have weapons?" Phillips didn't respond for a moment. "We have knives. We'll make it work." Before Bride could say anything, they heard several voices shouting on the next car and saw several Nazis climbing onto the roof, aiming their weapons. It was a makeshift firing squad, and Phillips and Bride were standing in the middle of the roof. They had no cover, nowhere to run. The Nazis lined up in a row and aimed. "Shit," Bride exclaimed, and, having no other option, stood and shoved Phillips over the side as hard as he could as the soldiers fired. He and Phillips tumbled down to the hard ground, crashed into it, and rolled several times before they lost momentum and stopped. Both felt like their entire bodies were on fire from the pain of the impact, and both had to refill their lungs with the air that had been knocked out of them. They both eventually managed to sit up and watch the train cars roll by. After a few minutes, the last one passed, and the train was gone. Despite the pain both were in, Phillips and Bride crawled forward to the tracks and looked down the line. They watched the last car vanishing into the distance, and soon it was lost to sight in the darkness. Just as the cause to stop the train was, it was a lost cause. It always had been. As they watched it fade from view in the distance, Bride had only one thing to say in response to watching it rumble away into the night. Fuck what Aaron Moore wants. They were alive, despite everything that had happened, and they weren't going to kill themselves trying to chase it down again. Once the train was gone, save for the fading noise of its distant roar, they sat back next to the tracks and recovered for a few minutes. Phillips eventually spoke as he shakingly got himself onto his feet once he was sure he could walk. "Come on, we have to go. We're still in hostile territory, and there's no flare to shoot off to get us out of it this time." He held a hand out, and Bride took it, and Phillips pulled him to his feet. Though it hurt, everything hurt, they unbuttoned their disguises and pulled the shirts off, followed by the pants. Leaving them on the tracks, now wearing only their own uniforms again, they set off away from the tracks and into the forest. Supporting each other as they walked in case the other's legs gave out, Bride was limping on one leg, they cut through the woods, towards where they knew a road would be, according to their now lost map anyway. All they had left if they needed to protect themselves were knives. Bride felt his legs give out suddenly, but he didn't fall. Phillips, whose arms were under his shoulders, pulled him back onto his feet. "Come on," Phillips encouraged, pulling Bride's arm over his shoulder. "Let's go," he said, supporting his friend despite the obvious pain and strain it put on him. They soon came out of the woods to another dirt road and collapsed in the middle of it. They couldn't go any further. Dense forest flanked the road on all sides. An owl hooted from somewhere nearby. They silently decided that they'd sit here and wait for the Allies, the Americans, British, Canadians, it didn't matter who, to catch up to them. The ever-present sound of explosions in the distance, drawing nearer, told them the Allies weren't far behind them. Every explosion sounded nearer than the last, and every explosion meant that the war was just that much closer to being won. At one point, they even thought they heard a plane flying somewhere in the distance, maybe dropping an airborne division into new territory. By the time the sun was coming up and the sky to the east turned a misty gray and silvery blue mix, a convoy rolled over the hill to the east, and Phillips and Bride watched it draw nearer to them coming along the road. A tank division, followed by numerous other vehicles and flanked by numerous American troops. Phillips and Bride stood and put their hands up to alleviate any chance of being mistaken for aggressors. The troops spotted them and ran forward. They quickly realized that the two were friendlies once they saw their uniforms. Seeing that they were also injured, two soldiers hurried forward and helped Phillips and Bride back into the safety of the convoy, one shouting, "Medic!" That was what was important at the moment, getting their fellow soldiers help. They could ask how two American soldiers found themselves way beyond the German-held line later. The tiny town the train had left from had been abandoned by the time the American forces arrived. It was secured by the advancing Allied forces without a struggle. Phillips and Bride noticed, though, when they were taken back there, that the train station had been burned to the ground, along with the map depicting the exact location of the secret rail line. Without it, neither Bride or Phillips felt confidence they'd be able to lead the American troops back to the spot it branched off the main line from. No doubt, all traces of the line had already been destroyed by the Nazis who had stayed back at the town. They were certain to leave no evidence behind. A search for the train was being launched nonetheless, but Phillips and Bride's role in the search was over. The medics who came to treat them looked shocked that the two sailors were even still standing when they saw them. There was hardly an inch of skin on their bodies that wasn't bruised, especially their backs and shoulders from the fall they both took off the train. Phillips and Bride were checked for broken bones, but they had none. The medics seemed surprised by this from how banged up they were. They were treated for what wounds they could be by the field medics, though. Several deep open scratches on the both of them were stitched up. The bullet that had struck Bride's shoulder had left an exit wound on the back of his shoulder, so it was easy to treat with the bullet not still being inside him. Phillips's gunshot wound was also easily treated, but they were told they needed a more thorough care and check back in the territory under complete control of the Allied forces. In the meantime, they spent the next several hours at the town resting up. They were given food and water, and the medics came to check on them a few times before they left with one of the battalions for the next push. The sound of vehicles rolling through was ceaseless, as was the march of boots on the road, but it was eventually joined by music. Someone had apparently found a record player in one of the buildings and was letting it play. An upbeat tune was sounding almost mournfully through the empty town. Phillips and Bride hoped that whoever lived here were not lying dead in the woods somewhere. Throughout the morning, they watched several divisions of tanks roll through, flanked by soldiers, and it really brought a feeling that the war was almost truly over. The sky was also filled with flocks of British planes. The Royal Air Force was taking over the skies held by the regime who'd been bombing them for years. It was a beautiful sight to see with a sunrise also accompanied by the first day of clear skies the two had seen since entering Poland. The overcast clouds had finally broken away for a gorgeous sunrise. It really did feel in that moment like the war would have already been over and that Europe was taken back from the Nazis. "Maybe it'll end before we can get shipped back to Alaska," Phillips said at one point, putting out a cigarette a passing soldier had offered him. Bride chuckled. "Maybe it'll end before Aramore can send us on some other batshit mission to die on." Phillips nodded. "Yeah, fuck him and what he wants." They both laughed at that. Though their task was a total failure, they didn't care. They were alive, and Aramore had never truly wanted the train stopped. He wanted them dead. Him not getting his wish was enough for them. Besides, Europe is in such chaos right now. War might end before he even learns we're still alive, Bride said. or before anyone has a moment to think about sending us back to the Alaska Navy. No complaints there. I'm over the cold weather, Phillips agreed. I'm over yippee boats, too. They were silent for a moment before Phillips added, Do you think he would? Aaronmore? He asked. Bride nodded. Hell yeah, war's not over yet. Well, Phillips said, let's hope we never see him again. They sat together as the sun continued to rise higher in the sky, as planes flew overhead, as battalions of soldiers marched past, and as divisions of tanks rolled by. The war might not have been over yet, but after the night they'd had, it was the most beautiful morning Phillips and Bride had ever seen. The train was gone, and with it so much knowledge, but light was returning to Europe nonetheless. The second dark age was almost over. The Nazi gold train supposedly was buried somewhere in southern Poland in the final weeks of the European theater of World War II. Perhaps it entered and was buried in an abandoned coal mine or in an undiscovered German bunker somewhere in the mountains as the Germans retreated out of Poland. It is suspected to have been associated with the construction project known as Project Reese. Numerous lost works of art, historical artifacts, and even possible secret weapons and scientific projects are theorized to have been buried with the train. It has never been found, despite extensive searches through the region of Poland it is believed to have traveled through. Nazi Germany surrendered in the West on May 7, 1945, and in the East on May 9, 1945. May 8th was thus declared VE Day. In 2015, a former Nazi supposedly made a deathbed confession that the train did indeed exist and was buried with all the gold and artifacts still on board. Today, many believe the story of the gold train to be a mere urban legend.